Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus, catching up on some video work that hasn't been getting done this week. Lot of stuff going on this week. So, a lot of you, especially over on Facebook, requested some gameplay of Hogaak versus the Burn deck. So I will tell you straight up, this is not necessarily 100% representative of the matches, how they play out in terms of a very good Hogaak player versus a very good Burn player. It will give you some idea of how to potentially disrupt the Hogaak deck, what Burn's role is based on play and draw, the effects of things like Tormod's Crypt and Rest in Peace in post-board games. Give you a good idea, pretty good of that if you don't have a ton of time. Test against it, especially since this deck is most likely getting banned in a week and a half. But for those of you doing MCQs the next couple weekends, it is good practice to see some Burn versus Hogaak matchups. I will also most likely likewise be doing an MCQ before Hogaak gets banned on the 24th. Haven't decided how I'm going to manage that yet, but anywho. The list we're playing is the list that's still my recommended list until Hogaak gets banned. 4 hate cards, 2 Tormod's Crypts, 2 Rest in Pieces, and then I usually board in a couple Path to Exiles. That's how the sideboarding goes from the Burn side, pretty much. Play draw dependent, I'm usually boarding out Boros Charms and Skewer the Critics on the draw. On the play, on the draw, I'm usually boarding out 2 copies of Eidolon and the 4 Boros Charms. With that, this is pretty much the stock list we've been playing for a little while. Deck is pretty solid overall, though we've had some weird results lately. We've had some really weird leagues with what we've played against, but overall, I'm pretty pleased with this list. And with that, let's take a look at the Hogaak list we're going to be playing against. Welcome back for the Hogaak deck tech. So, Hogaak obviously transformed after the banning of Bridge from Below. Some people say the deck might have gotten even faster and more consistent, which is kind of scary because that was a deck that was already capable of turn 2 or turn 3 kills, as it was with Bridge from Below and Altar of Dementia. The main change that underwent was adding Satyr Wayfinder to the mix to pair with Carrion Feeder. This gives you multiple creatures to fill your graveyard to also convoke Hogaak out. One of the things that it also freed up is it freed the deck to play things like Lightning Axe or Assassin's Trophy or Fatal Push in the main deck, so it kind of eliminated some of the deck's weaknesses to things like Thing in the Ice and such. A card that previously helped something like Phoenix have a pretty decent Hogaak matchup against the original builds, but being able to run kill spells and / anti-hate cards in the main deck is kind of scary. Frees up more slots in their sideboard. One thing to note, especially in the Burn matchup, is the Hogaak mana base, even in the 3-color version, is very painful. Unless they have multiple copies of Black Cliffs in their opener, they're often having to fetch Shocking. So often they're putting themselves to 15, so it is possible for Burn to TKO on turn 3 a lot more frequently with this deck, as they don't really have the ability to fetch around it, especially when they're playing, need to play something like, Faithless Looting on 1 and a Satyr Wayfinder on 2. Oftentimes it's really hard for the deck to be conservative with its life total, even if they are aware they're against Burn deck. Sideboard, main thing that they can bring in against us is Collective Brutality is kind of the house for their deck against us. Most of these lists are only running a couple. Some are starting to pick up a little bit more as they've realized they're kind of weak to Mono Red Phoenix and Burns particularly. Though the data from the GPs showed Burn had a kind of rough matchup, I do feel that wasn't necessarily great, but then again, in general, there's probably more high-end Hogaak players than there is Burn players, because people that are picking up Hogaak are probably people that are grinders, etc. Whereas Burn, people that just want to go to a GP, have fun, sometimes pick up Burn. Burn kind of has the stigma / reality of being a beginning deck in Modern. I'm not saying there aren't very good players to play the Burn deck that enjoy the archetype, etc. I'm just saying that in general, the skill for a Hogaak player is probably higher than a skill for a Burn player at something like a GP, because especially with Hogaak, everyone recognizing it's going to get banned, people that are playing this deck are going to have a high skill level with it, etc. Because it's not just a deck you just pick up and play. It is to a certain degree, but you're not going to play a deck that is going to be banned in 2 weeks if you're not someone who takes grinding rather seriously. That's like GPs. Cards they can potentially bring in against us are things like Fatal Push, if they want answers to early creature aggression. They could potentially bring in Thoughtseize to try to answer things like Rest in Peace or that kind of stuff. But the problem with Thoughtseize, especially against Burn, is you're already deleting your life total with your land base, so you really can't necessarily afford to bring in Thoughtseizes. Other cards they could bring in are copies of Nature's Claim and Force of Vigor. Force of Vigor obviously counters the things like Rest in Peace. Also has utility against things like Eidolon the Great Revel, and same thing with Nature's Claim. This gives them outs to Eidolon, which can be problematic, especially if they're on the draw and they have to cast multiple 1-drops or things kind of setting up first couple turns. Eidolon can easily hit them for 4 or 6 damage, plus the fact they don't have a ton of blockers in their deck. Satyr Wayfinder, Stitcher Supplier, Vengevine, and Hogaak can block, but things like Carrion Feeder, Gravecrawler cannot block, as well as Bloodghast. So that's one of the huge advantages Burn has in the matchup, is the fact that the Hogaak deck is not able to block particularly well unless they're landing a Hogaak or a Vengevine in the early turns. And beyond that, they can also bring in Nature's Claims as kind of a way to fight hate cards like Rest in Peace. Plague Engineer could potentially have some applications, but I think it's too slow to be relevant in the matchup. I think this is something more for like humans or goblins or something along those lines. Obviously, Leyland and the Void's just nonsense against a deck like Burn. So, cards you could potentially see our opponents bringing in is things like Nature's Claim, Fatal Push, Collective Brutality. Basically, things that either counter our hate cards or things that are good against Burn naturally, like Fatal Push and Collective Brutality. With that, let's get into some matches, and once again, a friendly reminder, if you like what you're seeing on the channel, please consider subscribing, give us a thumbs up, and a constructive comment down below, and I will do my best to commentate my thought process from the Burn side of the matchup. And the person that was playing the Hogaak deck was proficient with the deck, but by no means an expert, so keep in mind there might be some play mistakes on both sides of the thing, as this was a playtesting session and not an actual tournament live setting with 2 equally skilled people with the decks. So just be aware of that. Let's get into some matches. Welcome back for match number 1. Game number 1, huge thing, we won the die roll, which is very important in a matchup like this, as them spewing their hand on turn 2 is a lot less damaging on the draw. First hand was a mulligan. We mulligan into a very good 6-card hand. 4 lands obviously not ideal, but this 6-card hand is perfectly reasonable as we're pressuring them quite easily. Once again, their mana base is usually quite painful. See, they're having to do 3 damage themselves here. They discard a couple Bloodghasts. We go ahead and get in some pressure here. Drop them to 12, suspend the Riftbolt. They get their dudes back. They have to shock again, play their Sideboard Wayfinder. They don't have a Gawk. We put them to 6, and we just kill them on turn 3, which is kind of insane, but when they have to fetch shock with their mana base, obviously it gets very painful for them. Whenever you have 3 colors and you're a Jund-based deck and you're color intensive fairly early in the game, obviously it's problematic for them, but that's one of the advantages of something like Burn has over something like, say, Jund or something, where you don't really do a good job of pressuring the Hogaak deck early on. With that, let's get into some sideboard games. As I've already mentioned, we're going to be sideboarding in 2 Path to Exile, 2 Tormod's Crypt, 2 Rest in Peace, and on the draw we're going to be boarding out 2 Eidolons and 4 Boros Charms. So we're on the draw here for game number 1, or game number 2. Thought process behind this hand, I do believe I end up keeping this hand. Well, it does not have a graveyard hate piece per se. We only have 4, and especially on the draw, Rest in Peace isn't that particularly good. So I elect to keep this hand on the thought process that we can pressure our opponent quite well. They block, fill up the graveyard here. They play another Stitcher Supplier. They play Carrion Feeder. They get a Hogaak. We just kind of have to play our dude out, pass the turn. They Lightning Axe. Get some more stuff in the graveyard. Hit us for 8. Go ahead and Searing Blaze that guy. It's possible I should have Searing Blaze the Stitcher Supplier to get it out of the way. Collective Brutality here is kind of backbreaking. Kills our dude. Takes a Lightning Helix. And here we just kind of scoop up because we have no answer to the Gawk. Definitely the difference of play versus draw. It's possible I should have mulligan aggressively for Tormod's Crypt, but once again, how far are you willing to go down on resources against a hand that's pretty functional if they kind of stumble at all or deal themselves a bunch of damage? They had both the turn 2 Gak and the lack of damage from their lands, which made it really hard and ineffective for us to race. Plus, they had a Lightning Axe to kind of kill one of our backswing guys, so it was harder for us to pressure their late total. So, everything kind of coming together for the Gak deck there, and they all had, hit their one of Collective Brutality. But, once again, we wouldn't necessarily know that they're only packing one Collective Brutality, but that is something to note, that Collective Brutality is a very good card from the Hogaak side. Anyways, on to Game 3. Alright, we're back for Game 3. Take a look at this opener. This hand is interesting. I don't recall if I end up keeping it. The argument behind keeping it is you have Goblin Guide and a lot of burn spells to throw at their face. And if you hit a land, you have a Rest in Peace, but we are on the play with no white source in hands. This hand's a little bit risky. I do believe I end up pitching this hand, but I could definitely see keeping it. Alright, so this hand, we've got the interaction, we've got the Goblin Guide, we've got the Tormod's Crypt, and some pressure, so I think I end up keeping this, and I believe pitching the Mountain. Yep. And our opponent kept a 7, which is kind of scary. We see a Lightning Axe off of them. They play a Neonate, play that. Go ahead and crypt them here. They just let the Neonate go, which is kind of interesting. Seems like they have kind of a not so good start over there. And there's Lightning Axe. Starting to pressure us back a little bit. Wonder what their keep was, that they're not really doing a whole lot over there. Means they're nurturing peatlands, kind of a thing, and they just scoop it up. So, I guess their draw just didn't come together over there. Not really sure what their keep was. Sometimes, Gak's missing like a piece and just doesn't find it. It does seem like that was maybe a subpar keep from our opponent, and Burn just obviously able to pressure them out very quickly. Once again, their mana base doing themselves a little bit of damage, even though they did have the Blackling Cliffs and stuff, and once again, we didn't even have to use our Disruption piece here, so sometimes their draw just doesn't come together, but in my experience, that's not usually the case. Usually their draw comes together quite well if they mulligan correctly. Maybe they had like a Assassin's Trophy or something over there, but anyways, let's get on to the next match. And we're back for game number 1 of match number 2. Once again, we're on the play, which obviously is a huge plus in this matchup. I think this hand's a keep, but obviously, if you know the matchup, it's a little bit risky. We don't have one of the 1-drops that Burn's very good at doing. Suspend the Riftbolt. They have a Stitcher Supplier here. They have a Grave Crawler. Looks like they kept a 1-lander. And we just burned them out on turn 4. So, wonder what they were hoping to hit here. I guess if they hit a Gak off of this, they could potentially convoke it out. Once again, a little bit of a subpar hand. Maybe our opponent should be a little bit more aggressive at mulliganing the Hogaak thing. So I don't know how much value this particular game is, other than the fact that Burn can beat Hogaak's kind of subpar draws. So, anyways, let's get back into game number 2. We're back for game number 2. This hand's interesting. These are the kind of hands that usually land me in trouble. I like to keep these 1-land, like, kind of gamble hands. But there's no graveyard heat, and lacking a second land, I do believe this ends up being a mulligan. Yep, and then we mulligan into a couple pieces of interaction for their creatures, a couple Swift Spears. I think I end up keeping this hand because it's a 6. Our opponent is mulliganing as well. Throw back a Searing Blaze because the second one's likely not as effective. Once again, their deck doing the thing. block with the supplier. We play a Tormod's Crypt to blow out their graveyard. Yeah, obviously we're willing to trade off there, so probably leaving the Wayfinder around in case they find a Gak. Looks like they don't have a Gak. Trade off this turn, which I find interesting. Pitch Assassin's Trophy? Doing the thing with the carrion feeder here. Getting a large carrion feeder going, which is one of their various backup plans. Play a bolt here. And they just die on turn 4 again. So, one thing I have heard noted, some on the Burn forum, is that really good Hogaak players won't play out their copies of Stitcher Supplier on turn 1 necessarily. They're just going to fill the graveyard. I guess our opponent's line was, since they had both Stitcher Supplier and a copy of Seder Wayfinder, that they were fine trading off. And we didn't play the Tormod's Crypt pre-combat, so that kind of threw them off maybe a little bit. So, something to keep in mind. But this is what Burn does. They, even on a 1-land hand here, we drew a couple of bolts. We had a bunch of 1-drop creatures pressuring their life total. And once again, their land base takes a lot of damage. One thing we haven't seen, though, is we haven't seen a lot of consistent turn 2 Gaks out of our opponent, so maybe our opponent should be mulliganing aggressively. However, in this game, I do believe they mulligan to 5 here. So, I mean, they kept a fairly functional hand for a 5-card hand. They hit their land drops. They had a game plan going. It's just Burn closes the door really, really quickly. So that's one of the positives of playing the red aggro decks in the current format. And last weekend kind of showed that out with, the Phoenix decks, etc., doing fairly well against the Hogaak meta, both the SCG, etc. So, very important to note that red decks are kind of well positioned against Hogaak, being able to slam the door shut pretty quickly. Anyways, let's hop into another match and see how that goes. We are back for match number 3. We'll be on the play again, which obviously is huge. Sand's a pretty easy mulligan. Sand's also a mulligan. Our opponent has gone down to... No, they kept their 7. The Sand's pretty good for a 5-card hand. I think I end up pitching, a Rift Bolt and a land. Seems reasonable. Start Goblin Guiding them. They get a land off the deal. Faithless Looting, pitch a Thug and a Bloodghast. We get a lot of pressure on their life total here. They play a land. They have to deal themselves a lot of damage. There's a Wayfinder. There's a turn to Hogaak. Suspend the Rift Bolt there. Not the most mana efficient, but from a time perspective, we obviously have to kill them this turn. They play a Wayfinder. They get Vengevines. So that looks like a mistake here. Not playing these, getting these into play on last turn. They could have presented lethal here, but I suppose if they're playing around just Lightning Bolt here, that would make sense that they would, because that would make their attack not lethal. I don't know. Maybe they should have just played these out pre-combat and seen what happened, but I suppose they wanted to deny us information. And to be fair, we don't have lethal right this second. Do we get there this game? No, actually we lost this game. Looked really good for the home team there, but Hogaak doing Hogaak things, Even on the draw, it was enough to get there against us because we just weren't able to present quite enough damage, and they were just conservative enough with their life total with this Bloodstained Mire to not kill themselves. So once again, their land base is painful. That dealt them 4 damage. So, and we were on a mulligan to 5. So, if we had had maybe one more card, or this wasn't an Eidolon or something, maybe we would have gotten there. So just shows you how close this matchup is, even when they have their nut draw and you're on the play. So play draw is definitely a key factor in this matchup. We are back for game number 2. We'll be on the play again, which is nice. Sand's pretty good. Goblin Guide and Swift Spear, we have an interaction piece on turn 2, so we get to go Guide into Rest in Peace, which on the play, Rest in Peace is usually quick enough. They mulligan to 5, which is important to note. They see a Hogaak on top of their deck. We play a Neonate, we play a Rest in Peace. They don't sacrifice anything there, maybe they can't afford to, but I figured they would kill something here. Pitch a Hogaak, slowing down our clock. We are flooding out a little bit, so that is something to note. Looks like they're going to try to go on the counter-aggressive plan, which doesn't usually end well against burn opponents. Suspend the Riftbolt, hit their face, there's the Wayfinder. They flip over a couple Assassin's trophies, start pressuring us back. We are pretty substantially ahead in the race. They're probably sitting the blocking here. It's possible I should have pathed, but something like a Carrion Feeder could come down and be a problem. Collective Brutality coming back, kind of normalizing their life total a little bit. I go ahead and path here, buy us a little bit more time. So I think from this point we're pretty decently favored if we hit some spells. Their clock isn't particularly quick, and then we're just able to bolt them out. So once again, Collective Brutality can be a pretty key piece in them coming back and fighting through our particular stuff. But once again, when there was only 1 or 2 in their sideboards, usually not particularly an issue, but Collective Brutality is a card to be mindful of in the matchup, as the Hogaak players recognize that red is probably their biggest weakness in the current format, at least as things currently stand, and there probably won't be enough time for the format to come back around and find other weaknesses other than like Urza. So anyways, let's get on to game number 3. We are back for game number 3. I think this hand's a keep, but here we might see the Rest in Peace problem prop up. I don't really remember this game for sure, but we could easily see Rest in Peace pop up as a problem. This being too slow on the draw, but I think this is a functional keep. We don't have our 1-drop, but they mulligan to 6, so maybe they won't quite have enough resources to get going here. Go ahead and do the thing. They get a Bloodghast, they get a Gravecrawler, they play a Gravecrawler, get a Vengevine. So while they don't have a turn 2 Hogaak, they do have 2, 4, 6, 10 power on turn 2 without a Gaak. So, you know, kind of silly to play our, whatchamacallit at this point. We're kind of on the defensive game plan here. Go ahead and block there. I believe we bolt the... Why am I bolting the Gravecrawler here? That doesn't make much sense. Should be bolting the Vengevine. See if that comes back to bite us here. Probably will. Oh, I guess I was bolting the Gravecrawler because they wouldn't have had another zombie in play after we killed it here. I still think Vengevine might have been correct, although it turns out they would have just been able to get it back anyway. So maybe in the end that decision didn't matter, but we could potentially be at 2 life points total higher. Our opponent does have a lot of put them to 9 here. Opponent does the thing, brings their Vengevine back, and we just kind of die. So, you know, as you see, play draw is dependent, and even without Hogaak, they have certain draws with things like Vengevine, and Rest in Peace was just too slow. They were able to discard their Bloodghast and Vengevine, get it back before Rest in Peace was an effective thing. That's why some people, you know, argue for Leyline in the Void, and while Leyline in the Void is perfectly acceptable, if it's not in your opening hand, it's trash, And they do have 2 cards in their hand. One of them could easily be something like an Assassin's Trophy or Nature's Claim. They just never had to fetch for. So, you know, there's no guarantee that we would have, even with a Leyline in the Void on 0, would have been able to stop them there. So, able to see this matchup much more of what Hogaak is capable of on their very good draws. They were able to beat us this match because our opponent was able to mulligan the hands that were very effective. And, you know, we were just 1 point short in that first game because we mulliganed to 5. So, you know, it's a close matchup either way, and we will play at least one more match. Let's get into that. And we're back for match number 4. We're on the play, which is obviously huge. I guess we end up keeping this hand. This is one of those risky hands that's like, this double goblin guy is kind of insane, especially knowing the matchup. But maybe that was too greedy of a keep, but we'll see what ends up happening. Turn 1 Gravecrawler, not the best for them. See what they present here. Cedar Wayfinder, their keep makes a little more sense. We have a turn 2 Gak. Swingless Hogaak. We don't block. A couple suspended Rift Bolts here. And we just killed them. So, is that the turn? Yeah, that was a turn 2 Gak on the draw. It just wasn't good enough. So, this just shows that Burn is capable of, with their good hands, of competing with turn 2 Gak, at least on the draw. On the play, them getting a turn 2 Gak's just not really beatable. So, once again, I've stressed throughout this video, play draw, play draw, play draw, play draw, extremely dependent. So practice your die rolls. I'm kidding, can't really do anything about that. Anywho, let's get on to game number 2. We're back for game number 2. Sand is obviously a mulligan. We have a couple Searing Blazes to interact, but just feels like kind of garbage. This hand here, hand's reasonable. I think we end up pitching one of the lands back. Get a couple Bloodghasts. They get their Bloodghast back. They have another Faithless Looting. There's a Carrion Feeder. Turn 2 Gak. They're doing the thing. Turn 2. Really don't have much of a hope of racing that, and then we draw a Rest in Peace and just we're dead. So that's Gak doing the Gak thing. Once again, indication of why Rest in Peace is too slow in this matchup sometimes. So hence the need for things like Tormod's Crypt or Grafdigger's Cage or Leyline of the Void. Anywho, on to our third and final game in our final match. We are back. This hand's pretty reasonable, although I think it's a mulligan. Just the multiple 2-drop spells, even with the Tormod's Crypt. This hand's pretty decent. A functional 6-card hand with a Rest in Peace on the play is good enough. I believe one of the pitches is one of the Lightning Helixes. Yep, so go Swizzle Spear. We have a Stitcher Supplier. Do the thing. Once again, their thing would be very well set up if we didn't have this Rest in Peace here. So there you go, Gravecrawler. Gravecrawler was a lot like a couple games ago where they had that kind of slow start. They pitch Overgrown Tomb, a couple of lands, I guess. They brutality us, pitching Nurturing Peedland. They continue pressuring us. This is kind of a race to what happens better. We're able to get one of their creatures off the board at like no cost to ourselves. Slows their clock down. We play an Eidolon. They attack. It's possible we should have actually blocked with Eidolon there, just because that inhibits our abilities to cast spells. They attack. That fetch was a little convoluted, maybe. Maybe they weren't supposed to fetch there, because that puts them dead to like any spell off the top of our deck. and Searing Blaze. We'll just do it here. So, final takeaway from these set of videos. I think the matchup is very close. I think it is somewhat skill dependent, especially from the Hogaak side. Burn, we have certain things, you know, knowing what cards to mulligan, what cards can goldfish on turn 3.5, turn 4. But I think the two biggest takeaways from this, outside of kind of already known quantities, and that you need Graveyard Hate to interact with Gak, and you can't beat Hogaak's Nut Draw on turn 2 when they're on the play, is this matchup is very play draw dependent, and the most key card from their side, outside of answering Graveyard Hate and their normal draws, is Collective Brutality. So if you notice, you know, as you're playing in events, if you're seeing Hogaak players toward the top tables, and you're toward the top tables, if you notice how many Collective Brutalities they're bringing in, that's a card that may warrant bringing in something like Skullcrack, although these games are honestly so fast and brutal, I'm not sure we can even afford to bring in Skullcrack. But that is a card that is picking up in some steam in some of these Hogaak lists, so be aware that is a card that does exist, and you need to be able to play around as best to your ability, that is. And beyond that, I think the matchup is close. Needs some amount of interaction, things like Path to Exile, things like Deflecting Palm. Rest in Peace is fine on the play, it's a little slow on the draw, so maybe don't even consider bringing it in on the draw, I'm not sure. Tormod's Crypt, obviously a pretty big piece of the puzzle at points. People question why Tormod's Crypt over Grafdigger's Cage. So the problem with Cage is, yeah, Cage comes down on 1, shuts down some of their shenanigans, but they're still able to cast a Hogaak from their hand by delving. They're still able to, you know, find one of their hate pieces with something like a Faithless Looting, blow up your Cage, and then go about their business. Tormod's Crypt just sets them back on cards. One of the things, they are to a certain degree a self-mill strategy. They're trying to fill that graveyard to cast a Hogaak. And if you're not able to interact with them, you die. You know, so you need to keep hands that are a really, really fast kill, interact with them, or interact with them and can present a fairly reasonable clock, and kind of hope that they don't always have the nut draw on turn 2. So matchup, I don't think was quite as lopsided as was presented in these videos. I think that we won a lot of die rolls, which played into winning 3 of the 4 matches. And I think that when they have their nut draws on turn 2, when they're on the play, we can't beat them. When they have their nut draws when they're on the draw in turn 2, we are able to beat those draws, potentially with our own good draws. So something to keep in mind when you're looking at your hands. Make sure you keep functional hands and don't be loosey-goosey with your keeps. So, anywho, sorry for the late video, but there's been a lot of stuff going on. We finally got up to 1,000 subs. Thank you very much, everybody. And we will be doing some other videos coming out this weekend, but I wanted to get this video up and hopefully uploaded, so, you know, people who are heading to MCQs and stuff might be able to take a look at this, you know, on the way tomorrow. And as always, I want to thank you guys, the viewers, for making this channel possible. This has been John for MTG Nexus. If you want to help support our channel, please consider checking out our Patreon page. Link is down below. I do a sideboard guide for Patreons of $1 or more, updated the 1st and 15th every month, and obviously there will be some updates once Hogaak gets banned, hopefully. So, anywho, that'll be all for this video. Hope to see you all later.